Hello, everyone. My name is Gleb Papyshev. Submission number is 21. Today, I'm going to present a paper titled Governance of Disruptive Emerging Technologies, Regulatory Gifting for Artificial Intelligence in Russia. I'm working on this paper together with Masaru Yeremia. So this research project investigates how the dynamics of interactions between the regulators and stakeholders from different sectors influence the development of the emerging regulatory regime for AI in Russia. Despite the novelty of this technology, two key policies for governance and regulation of AI have already been published in Russia. They are titled "The Degree of the President of the Russian Federation about the Development of Artificial Intelligence in the Russian Federation" and "The Concept of the Development of Regulation in the Field of Artificial Intelligence and Robotics till 2024. In this research project, we trace how these two documents were developed and how the visions of the ideal shape of the regulation shared by different stakeholders affected the final shape of the policy. Before we proceed to the discussion of the case study, it is important to spend some time articulating the key theoretical terms used in this research project. As this project is focused on the way in which non-state actors influence the development of AI policy in Russia, then the literature addressing the role of industry interest in the development of regulatory regime is important here. In academic literature, this phenomenon is often presented as regulatory capture, in its broad term referring to the process through which regulated monopolies end up manipulating the state agencies that are supposed to control them. Regulatory capture is not a form of corruption, but rather an intricate relationship between the regulator and the regulatee, where the latter has a persuasive power over the former, which leads to disproportionate participation of businesses in the rulemaking process. One of the key difficulties of regulating emerging disruptive technologies is that it is very hard to determine which model of the regulation, for example, command and control or self-regulation, would work best because of the scarcity of information about technologies through side effects. These higher degrees of uncertainties associated with emerging technologies force regulators to rely on facts provided by experts, often making the regulation biased towards the interests of private actors because of information asymmetry. In the field of AI governance, private interests in the policymaking process are exercised when vague policy wording is disguised as self-regulatory instruments for the governance of AI, which raises concerns about the effectiveness of this regulatory approach globally. This phenomenon is often referred to as ethics washing, superficially portraying an ethical behavior by a technological company by using vague terminology of ethical principles to avoid public backlash and strict command and control regulation for the government. While most traditional scholarship on regulatory capture tended to depict this phenomenon in a negative light, recently the academic discussion about the relationship between regulatory capture and public value became less dogmatic. Most of the literature on regulatory capture frames it as an attempt of private interest groups to benefit through the design of policy at the expense of public interest. New empirical findings show, however, that in certain situations, regulatory capture can be enlightened and used to advance public interest rather than harm them. This can lead to scenarios when governments intentionally allow private organizations that are being regulated to influence the shape of the regulation, thus enacting a different model of the political relationship between the regulator and the business, where the regulator intentionally allows the regulation to be designed in favor of industry interests based on consultations with industry, but not necessarily under pressure from it and not at the expense of public interest. Jude Brown proposed to call such formation a regulatory gift, which can be understood as a reform that is overtly designed by the government to reduce or reorient regulators' functions to the advantage of the regulated and in line with market objectives on a potentially macro scale. An important feature of regulatory gifting is that it does not intend to favor industry interests over public interests, but rather in some cases can be thought of as the best possible form of regulatory intervention. The primary source of data in this research consisted of 21 semi-structured interviews with government officials, practitioners in the AI industry in Russia, and academics, all of whom participated in the process of developing AI policy in Russia in different roles. A snowballing strategy was used when several participants were contacted first and then asked to share the context of other participants in the process. The interviews were conducted in April and May of 2011. Each interview lasted between 40 to 90 minutes. The second source of data used in this research project consisted of policy documents, governmental websites, media reports, and reports from international organizations. Before proceeding to the discussion of the events that led to the creation of these documents, it is important to briefly introduce the key stakeholders in this process. The first key actor is Sber, formerly known as Sberbank of Russia. Sber is the biggest systemic financial institution in the country, with 50% plus one shares owned by the Ministry of Finance of the Russian Federation. Sber has been slowly transforming into a technological corporation in the last decade after it opened an IT branch titled Sber Tech in 2011, which has over 500 participants with more than 11,000 employees. The company also trained more than 35,000 employees in AI technology competencies at Sberbank's corporate universities. In September 2020, the company announced that it is going to drop the word bank from its name and rebrand itself as Sber. This decision was made because the company wants to transform from a major bank into a big tech corporation. The second key stakeholder is Skolkovo, a not-for-profit foundation established in September 2010 by the President of the Russian Federation, which seeks to create an innovative technological ecosystem in Russia to foster innovation and entrepreneurship. The ecosystem of Skolkovo was later expanded by the creation of a technopark titled the Skolkovo Innovation Center and the Graduate Research University, Skoltech. The key policy framework that governs the digitalization of the Russian economy is the Digital Economy Development National Project. To execute this project, key technological companies from Russia, under the supervision of the Russian government, created an autonomous, non-commercial organization, ANO Digital Economy, which supervises the execution of the policy program. The scheme here on the slide represents a simplified version of the institutional architecture of this program. This grand national project is operationalized through several more targeted federal projects led by the centers of competency. Centers of competency are responsible for the coordination of the execution of the federal project and the management of a working group comprised of numerous stakeholders from different sectors of the economy. Each of the stakeholders mentioned above is the organization appointed as a center of competency. Sber is the center of competencies in artificial intelligence federal project, which aims at developing the conditions to foster the AI industry in Russia, while Skolkovo is the center of competencies in the federal project titled Normative Regulation of Digital Environment, which seeks to develop a legal basis for the regulatory regime of emerging technologies in Russia. Let's proceed with the discussion of the case study events. Sber was tasked with writing the text of the national AI strategy of Russia. At that moment, Sber did not yet have the department with the capabilities needed for drafting AI policy within the organization. And due to this reason, Sber decided to hire its subsidiary consulting firm, titled Strategy Partners, to write the first draft of the national AI strategy of the Russian Federation. Strategy Partners consulted with different stakeholders in the field of AI in Russia and drafted the final version of the document. The document was then sent for approval to the supervising authorities such as President's office. The document sets broad definitions for the key terms such as AI and establishes the key principles such as protection of human rights and liberties, security, transparency, technological sovereignty, innovation cycle integrity, responsible thrift, and support for the competition as the key principles governing this policy and the industry in the country. Regulation is not its primary concern, and the issue is only addressed in one paragraph that says, to stimulate the development and use of artificial intelligence technologies, the adaptation of statutory regulations relating to human interaction with artificial intelligence is needed, together with the formulation of the appropriate ethical standards. Here, excessive regulation in the sphere might significantly slow the pace of development and introduction of technological solutions. Almost simultaneously, Skolkovo started working on the concept of the development of regulation in the field of artificial intelligence and robotics till 2024. The process of working on this policy document started in 2018 after Skolkovo ordered a consulting report about the state of AI regulation in the world from an international law firm, Dentons. This report summarized the key initiatives in AI regulation from different countries. Based on the findings of the report prepared by Dentons, the first draft of the concept of regulation was prepared by Skolkovo in the summer of 2019. The draft of the document was proposing concrete regulatory measures seeking to avoid ill-defined terminology common in principle-based regulation, which was supposed to regulate the development and deployment of AI technologies in the country. As a response to this proposal, SBIR drafted another version of the document that was much less oriented at trying to establish a strict regulatory regime for AI and was emphasizing the importance of self-regulation and stimulation of business activities in AI. The two stakeholders, Skolkovo and SBIR, were not able to find a consensus, so the Ministry of Economic Development of the Russian Federation had to intervene and take control over the document drafting. The key problem over which the two stakeholders disagreed was an overall approach to regulation. While Skolkovo was promoting stricter regulation over technology with precise metrics and accountability mechanisms, SBIR was lobbying the idea of industry self-regulation. This conflict is well summarized in a quote from one of the respondents, who said, "The possibility of effective self-regulation of this industry in Russia is questioned due to several reasons. As can be observed by different associations within the business community, all of the self-regulatory documents that are publicly available are written in a modality of it would be good to, it is recommended that, it is suggested that, while similar documents with the same title of codes of ethics or codes of conduct in other professions, such as lawyers or medical workers, are written in the modality of obligation. Those who enter the professions are not recommended to do something, but they must do it under the threat of sanctions from the professional community. In Russia, there are concerns that the mechanisms of self-regulations are being developed to avoid responsibility by the developers of AI systems. These concerns were discussed in the process of working on the documents." In the end, the actual regulatory measures proposed in the document are quite vague and do not describe the detailed mechanisms of the regulatory control over the technology of AI. The document is paying a lot of attention to the mechanisms of self-regulation in the form of ethical codes and codes of conduct created within companies. For example, one of the key regulatory principles from the document states, expanding the use of instruments of co-regulation and self-regulation, creation of codes of ethical rules for development, introduction, and implementation of technologies of AI and robotics. Another quote summarizes the process in its entirety. The quote says, "At first, there were formulated concrete regulatory measures. However, after numerous discussions and consultations, they were thrown away and substituted by a much more blurry and general wording. As a result, the document ended up being in favor of everything good against everything bad." The case shows how information asymmetry and the lack of in-house capacities about the technology of AI forced the regulator to invite other stakeholders to participate in the process of formulation of AI regulation in the country. By allowing SBIR to write the text of the national AI strategy and then letting it to counter the regulatory proposal presented by Skolkovo in the process of working on the second policy, which at the end allowed SBIR to make sure that the final version of the regulation emphasized self-regulation by industry over other approaches to regulation, the government was intentionally performing regulatory gifting. As explained by the employees of the federal level organization in the interview, the lack of technical capacities within the government makes it extremely hard to create regulations for emerging technologies without the expertise from the business sector. This can be illustrated by a quote from an interview, which says, "Without business, it is very difficult to publish normal regulations now, because governmental authorities are lagging behind a lot in technological agenda and do not understand many things. It is crucial to receive a consolidated opinion from the business, which will be considered in regulation. Otherwise, the regulation will be developed in a way that nobody needs and that does not work as it was before, because it absolutely does not correspond to technological realities. By allowing private industry to articulate their vision about the shape of the regulation, and by incorporating in the text of the regulation, the regulatory agency was giving the AI industry in Russia a regulatory gift, where the gift itself was an ability to formulate regulatory framework in vague terms and introduce non-enforceable and non-binding principles as the main regulatory mechanism under the umbrella of a self-regulatory approach. The situation in Russia shall not be understood as a conventional regulatory capture, because the regulators were not letting business interest be articulated in the regulation at the expense of the public interest. Rather, the incorporation of industry interests in the text of the regulation was seen as a means to act in favor of public interests, because of other actions in favor of public interests were not available in the toolbox of the regulators due to information asymmetry and the lack of in-house capacities about the technology of AI. The act of gifting in the form of ethics washing is summarized in a quote. Colleagues from Sber lobbied lesser usage of explainability in the text so that all of the questions related to transparency were formulated in a vaguer form with fewer commitments for developers and business. This situation is very similar to the observation by Thomas Metzinger that the high-level expert group on AI in the EU glossed over the difficult problem of explainability under the pressure from the industry representatives that were a part of the group. It is impossible to predict whether this approach to the design of the regulation for AI in Russia is the right one or not in the long run, because as history shows, new regulations are often created after regulatory tragedies. But thankfully, there has not yet been an AI Chernobyl. So to sum up, the key finding of this article highlights a phenomenon of regulatory gifting in the field of emerging technology regulation, when state regulators have to rely on the industrial expertise in the design of regulatory interventions, and through that design regulation favorable for industry because of the information asymmetry between the regulator and the innovator and the lack of in-house technological capacities within public organizations. These findings constitute a broader argument in the field of emerging technology governance that as the information asymmetry about the technology between the industry and the government widens, the influence of industry over the regulation would become stronger unless technological capacities are established within the regulatory organization. More research on the potential design for mechanisms to balance different interests is needed, as well as a further comparative research in this domain to understand if such behavior of the governmental actors is common in other jurisdictions dealing with the regulation of emerging technologies. Thank you very much. This is the end of our presentation.